This week on Quadriga, Venezuela after Chavez. Can revolution go on? An era has ended. For 14 years, Hugo Chávez had the reins firmly in his grip in Venezuela. A self-styled revolutionary leader, Chavez was a champion of Venezuela's poor and oppressed, as well as a figurehead for leftist movements throughout Latin America. But the longer he remained in power, the louder the dissenting voices became. His opponents accused Chavez of having adopted an increasingly autocratic leadership style and are now hoping for the end of the country's socialist revolution. Is Venezuela heading for a power shift? Your host this week, Ali Aslan.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. Hugo Chávez was Latin America's most charismatic leader, at least one of them, as well as one of the most polarizing figures on the continent. So today, we want to look at the political legacy of Hugo Chávez. How much did he accomplish and where did he possibly fall short? And I want to do so together with the three experts who've been following the story very closely. Welcome to Rieck, who's a German-Argentine and a political analyst at the Global Governance Institute in Brussels, with a focus on Latin America. Michael Levitin is a U.S. journalist who started his career at the Bolivian Times and has covered Latin America extensively ever since. And Ana Soliz Landivar is a native of Bolivia and a research fellow at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, GIGA, in Hamburg. Welcome to you all. Rieck. Hugo Chávez, undoubtedly one of the most polarizing political figures in Latin America. Why was he so polarizing? Why was opinion so deeply divided on him?
Polarizing, that's exactly the word. It's actually one of the most enduring legacies of Bolivarianism, that even though polarization was actually there before, we had a stable two-party system for almost 50 years, but the Bolivarians actually used it and made it stronger. So championed by the left, hated by the right, but still a transformative presidency in the true sense of the word.
Michael Levitin, even after his demise, even in death, Hugo Chávez is a much talked about political figure and individual. How do you explain this phenomenon?
I think that Chavez rose to power at a time in which the whole world, there were shifts. It was pre-9/11 from the American perspective, but it was also after the age of neoliberalization from Washington, in which policies really affected Latin American economies. As the United States' attention shifted to Iraq and Afghanistan and looked elsewhere, he rose up at a really important time, really in Latin American history, and led this shift leftward that many leaders, from Bolivia to other countries followed. So both the era of which he was a part and his leadership, his ability to seize it.
And indeed, Anna, as Michael said, Hugo Chávez inspired a left-wing revival in Latin America. He's often mostly credited for that, in particular also your country, your native country, Bolivia. Do you think the credit that is given to him due to this inspired left-wing revival is justified?
Completely. That is a success of Hugo Chávez, no? He was the person who was supporting this new left movement in the region. He was also initiator of new regional project through this ALBA. And that was a really important person who then will influence the other new president, left president in the region. Yeah.
And Rieck, Hugo Chávez, if we look at what he has accomplished and what he will be remembered for, perhaps mostly, is the social reform programs that he implemented for the poor, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. What Bolivarianism has been very good at, it has brought a previously marginalized group, a large group, the poor, into the middle, put them center stage, right, in the political process and political discourse. And I think this is here to stay. We see the opposition movement also talking social democratic topics now. So this will be an enduring legacy, absolutely.
Enduring legacy. Michael Levitin, Chavez gave voice to the marginalized and excluded, many are saying. You agree?
I absolutely agree, and I also agree that even more important than giving them voice, he actually provided a platform through his creation of essentially, through socialist ideals, these 30,000 or so communal councils where he's empowering communities to take charge in their neighborhoods, in their townships, to make their own decisions. He tried to serve as an example, and of course he had many faults and was quite a, took very much power and shifted it to the presidency in a way that many object to, but as a leader to say, you are responsible for governing yourselves. It isn't a one-person nation. Let's all take more responsibility in a democratic state. I think that was an incredible achievement.
Moreover, he is the creator of this participative democracy. No? And that is not only voices, but they say, okay, you are responsible for your life. What do you want to do? You have to do it. And he gave power to the people. Now, the problem with that is how they supported that. No? And there we have problem with the economy, but really it's important to recognize that he really do this participative democracy in Venezuela.
And Christian Rieck, indeed, Hugo Chávez gave education, medical care, food to the poor. But at the same time, poverty is still widespread in Venezuela, isn't it?
Right, but it's down. Actually, it's been halved since 2003, from some 69% to now some 23 or so percent. And extreme poverty is down even more. And so, yeah, this is important. Yeah, and it could not have been done without the Cuban connection. Right, so it's basically this is the most successful Cuban development program. Yeah. But paid for by Venezuelan oil money. But let me say one thing. Assistentialism, right, or subsidies, the programs there, the misiones as they're called, right, is not the same thing as emancipation or empowerment. Yeah? And structurally, if you look at the poverty, it's down, yes, because the oil price is so high. But if the oil price goes down, we see that the structures lying below, yeah, so basically unemployment, yeah, a mono export economy, so it's just oil basically, and Venezuela imports everything else. All these underlying problems are still there. So this is the question now, is how will the next administration deal with these underlying problems?
And Michael, go ahead, jump in.
I mean, the oil, obviously oil is he rose to power essentially on, oil grew tenfold in value, what, $9 a barrel in 2000 or something in that range, and now 100. I mean, pretty extreme. You can't say that his power would be the same without oil. But his ability, I think, that goes along with the creation of this more participatory democratic process and shifting power, the ability to kick out giant multinational oil corporations, to actually stand up to companies like Exxon that are essentially more powerful than countries in themselves, and to say, I'm sorry, if you're not willing to give us more of the share of your cut, you're gone, and to actually follow through with that. He obviously enraged the free market oil economy, but he also made a point that the resources of a country, they have the largest oil resources in the world, more than Saudi Arabia, it's now confirmed. They're the fourth largest exporter of oil to the U.S. Venezuela holds a lot of cards.
And Anna, as she said, he's had wide influence not only in Venezuela, but certainly all of Latin America. How is his death being perceived in Latin America?
Okay. First, Chavez helped the region with these mission social programs that he developed in Venezuela, and that was export to another countries in Latin America. Then with the creation of the ALBA, they started to really institutionalize this cooperation with countries in the region, especially with the small countries in Central America and in South America with Bolivia, Ecuador, especially with these countries. But then we can see also that it was not only with these ALBA countries, but also with other countries like Argentina and Brazil. And moreover, Hugo Chávez also initiated or was the supporter of another model of regional integration, like UNASUR and later with CELAC. No?
Where he tried to merge Latin America with the Caribbeans politically anyway. But again, Christian, the reaction in Latin America, not just Venezuela, but Latin America, is it different from country to country in Latin America?
I mean, yes, absolutely. Of course, of course, the ALBA group of countries has totally different political discourse and also larger majorities in favor of these Bolivarian ideas than other countries like Brazil, which is much more social democratic, or even Argentina, which used to be much more neoliberal, but now it's moving towards the Chavista model, although I'm not sure that's really going to happen in Argentina. But so there's many differences between the different countries, and of course the large groups, the conservatives, however you define them, who are actually now happy that Chavez is gone, although they also don't have a clear alternative. What's going to happen and what to do with Venezuela?
What to do with Venezuela is certainly also on the mind of the United States. We'll talk a bit more about that in a second, but let's focus on the economy, on the Venezuelan economy, just for one more moment. Again, you reached out to the poor, but at the same time, many people are saying that crime and corruption has actually risen during the Chavez reign. What do you say?
Can't argue with it. The numbers are up, and people discuss Caracas as one of the most violent capitals in the world. You know, inflation is also up. There's obviously major problems, and I think to say that he successfully completed some kind of transformation of the country is not accurate. It's in the middle and in the midst of it, and the new president coming in, his vice president who will take over.
So did Chavez have a too narrow focus, perhaps? As far as the economy is concerned, maybe too much focused on helping the poor rise up?
Yeah, in some way that was assistencialism, no? I think there is a point between empowerment of people, but also assistencialism. These social programs are supported, especially with money from the PDVSA, the oil company. And that produced a big problem for this company because the problem was that they didn't do the investment thinking in long term, no? Only thinking in the short term. Especially they gave more assistencialism in the moment of presidential campaign.
And
so a very short-term approach.
Yeah.
Also perhaps his kind of a failure, I don't know if they call it a failure, but to seize land. I mean, that he really took aggressive measures, which obviously alienates the elites and those who would be investing more in the country when you threaten to seize their properties, a la kind of a socialist move. That probably, it didn't really go over well, I don't think. He made strides, but that was not considered one of his achievements.
And Christian, aside from the mixed review as far as the economy is concerned, a lot of people are saying, even now that he's passed away, that he was not a Democrat in the sense that actually he sought autocratic rule, he sought a one-party rule, and then he ruthlessly clamped down on opponents. That's at least what his opponents are saying. Would you agree with that assessment?
That's one of the narratives. Yeah. The other narrative, of course, would be the participatory democracy narrative, right? So yeah, I mean, of course, the Chavistas or the Bolivarian movement has created a new model of development, right? Let's say a new model of politics and development. Well, part of it, of course, is a redefinition of the role of the state, a reassertion of the role of the state in the economy, which is logical after the neoliberal Washington consensus, of course. But then again, on the other side, it led to a hyper-centralization or an even stronger hyper-centralization in the executive. And so basically, this is an erosion of democracy. And the question now is, can you have, do they necessarily go together? Or is there a possibility of redefining democracy, but keeping the new development model?
But in an era in which governments seem so polarized and divided across the world, where there is this left-right tension, which is really center-left, center-right, that is disenabling governments to actually make real reforms in general. It's as though he took that risk and he assumed the risk that he was being too autocratic, to actually achieve something, which in itself is impressive because it seems like we're not seeing that elsewhere. Although it'll be interesting to see if other countries like Bolivia, like Ecuador, which have leaders who have modeled themselves in Chavez's sort of shadow a bit, whether they do that as time goes on.
And Hugo Chávez's shadow is indeed a big one. Even his opponents would argue that he's leaving a void behind, which his successors rather, might have difficulties to fill in the shoes. What's next for Venezuela, both home and abroad? Let's have a quick look.
The death of Venezuela's larger-than-life leader leaves the country facing a serious political vacuum. His successor is widely expected to be either his confidant and Vice President Nicolás Maduro or his rival and opposition leader Enrique Capriles. Chávez's absence will also be felt on the global stage. He was instrumental in bringing Latin American countries into a stronger coalition. A permanent thorn in the side of the US, Chavez allied himself with Iran and other opponents of Washington. Despite Chávez's rocky relations with the US, Venezuela has been and remains a top 4 oil supplier to its northern neighbour. Obama has said he is now looking forward to improving relations with the next Venezuelan leadership.
So a few changes await Venezuela, both at home as well as in its relations with other countries. Let's look at the domestic front for a second, Christian. The Vice President Nicolás Maduro is now standing as the candidate for Hugo Chávez's party. Do you expect him to be the next president?
Yeah. I think there's a sympathy vote. And since the elections are coming up in 30 days, I think it'll carry this month, and it'll carry Nicolás Maduro to the presidency. But I think it's wrong to see Nicolás Maduro as a second Chavez. Yeah? He's not another messianic leader as Chavez used to be. He just lacks the charisma. And also, he only came to the top, he rose to the top because he was not like Chavez, right? So now there's a problem. And the transition now that's going on within the Bolivarian movement is going towards some sort of coalition government within the Bolivarian movement that is quite multifaceted and complex. And Nicolás Maduro will be the face, but I think Diosdado Cabello, which is the president of the parliament, he's the one who's going to be he's going to be the most important person in the political machine in the background.
Ana, Christian expects Maduro to be the next president, perhaps carried in office by sympathy vote, as he called. And what about the opposition? What about Enrique Capriles? He lost to Chavez in the last presidential election. How much chances do you give him?
He lost the last presidential election, but I think he did a very good campaign, an intelligent campaign, no? Because he was presenting a person more close to the policy of Chavez. He said, okay, if I become president of Venezuela, I will maintain all the good things that Chavez did. And that's what's really important. He's showing our not so radical position in Venezuela, and that is good. But that is Capriles. But if we talk about the opposition, there is 19 political parties, no? And I think I can see the worst enemy of the opposition is not the Chavismo, it's the opposition, because they don't have a really unity.
But still, I mean, there's a double transition going on in Venezuela, and the transition in the opposition is quite promising because it's not just Enrique Capriles, right? There's other political leaders who could become president.
Yeah, but there you cannot really find a leader. I cannot see some young leader you can see, but you don't have a person who can really take the lead and to say, okay, we will do opposition and to do a really good presidential campaign. And at this moment, I think in this presidential election, they doesn't have any possibility to win. We will see as new president Maduro.
Well, Hugo Chávez has been in power for 14 years. That's a long time for any opposition. Christian?
Yes. I wanted to say one more thing. You said it's 19 different parties in the opposition, but at least now in this campaign in 2012, we saw this table of unity. It's called the Mesa de Unidad, and this is a new development for Venezuela, because after the demise of the old stable two-party system, we now have at least something. Well, short of a coalition, short of a singular party. So that's a step forward. And Capriles now could never become president. He's been burned. He's lost twice in the past 6 months.
Or maybe not this presidential campaign. I think it could be the next.
You will have to be patient a little longer than...
He's young.
He's young. Michael Levitin is also young. And in that sense, the question is... At the end of the day, the Vice President Maduro said something what I found to be very interesting. He suggested in the announcement of Chavez's death that there might have been foul play involved. What do you make of this?
Foul play being
that
CIA,
Chavez was poisoned.
Poisoned a la the Russian situation. I don't think it translates as well as how clearly the Putin regime probably had a bad hand in plutonium poisoning several years ago with one of their experts. No, I don't at the moment think that that's a realistic. I think Maduro is trying to seize, as you say, he's obviously trying to seize Chavez's momentum, and part of Chavez's persona and charisma, which he's saying, I am Chavez now, yes? He's trying to tell the people, I am the next incarnation of your leader, in a sense. He needs to be put a front against the United States right off the bat, right? The United States, Washington, has been relatively strapped since the failed coup of 2002, when it was proved that George Bush, that essentially the U.S. government approved of a failed coup that lasted for 48 hours. Ever since then, Chavez has used that evidence against the United States to rally support against imperialism in general from the U.S. and market domination. But I would say that it's premature to say that there was any involvement on that line. That it's a way to show the U.S. by expelling 2 attachés right off the bat before you're even in power, essentially. You're going to face the same regime that you had under Chavez.
And let's look at Venezuela's relationship with the United States, particularly during the Chavez regime. Michael Levitin, it's clear that Hugo Chávez tried to diminish U.S. influence in Latin America. It's clear that he was not benign, if you will, towards the U.S. regime, certainly not under George W. Bush. He was a bit more lenient than once President Obama came into power. What do you expect for U.S.-Venezuelan relations to come? How do you expect them to be from now on?
I expect that the ball seems to be in Venezuela's court, in a sense. I mean, they need to keep improving their economy and maintain relations. This oil relationship is not going to evaporate. It's going to maintain. Venezuela is one of the largest exporters to U.S. for oil. However, I think that the resilience, the ability to hold off U.S. sort of market dominance and the will of U.S. corporations, I think that's established. I think that Chavez did something unique and very courageous in a sense that all of Latin America looked at, that we don't need to be just your backyard the way that we have been for hundreds of years, 150 years. He kind of reoriented and said we can stand up to the Yankees in a way that is felt by most people, but most governments simply don't have the courage to say it.
And you know, one interesting thing with Maduro, you can read in the media and they say, Maduro is a more radical persona into the Chavista government. But I think he will be more pragmatic president because he needs to do it. We already see that, saw that, because, you know, the last month, already meet official person from the U.S. government and Venezuela government. And that was the first thing that Maduro did. And therefore, I think for just necessity, they will look for more close relation with the United States. They need investment.
So, Christian, do you expect Chavez's death to improve relations with the United States?
Not necessarily improve relations, because the Bolivarian idea needs the United States to be the bad guy, right? Yeah. It needs this contrast, right? Because it legitimizes a lot of things domestically. So it's going to still be a tense relationship, but yes, as you say, it will have to be more pragmatic. Also domestically, because now the Chavista movement is learning the hard way that the new development model, so reorganizing society and the economy, can only go so far. You can alienate the elites. I think that's fine. Yeah, that works because there are not so many. But the middle classes is a different problem. And now we see that the middle classes have been alienated from the Bolivarian project. Now they have to try to get them back into the fold. So Bolivarianism will have to go through another mutation, become more pragmatic, more pro-business too. And that's why Diosdado Cabello is the right guy.
But the idea that Washington has so focused on Chavez as an individual who has allied himself with regimes and other individuals like Ahmadinejad in Iran, like Syria's Bashar al-Assad, and various leaders, almost as really to show the U.S., you don't have any relations with these people, but I will. Not necessarily out of interest to Venezuela to be allied with Syria, but to make a point.
And I agree with Christian. They need to maintain this speech. No, they need an enemy for maybe internal reason. But the fact for the economy, they will be more close with the United States. Yeah.
But the need for the enemy, as you all have mentioned, how much does it resonate with the average person on the streets of Venezuela? At the end of the day, is there really so much anti-American resentment in Venezuela that you can tap into it?
It's not just Venezuela. I think this is an established Latin American topic. Yeah, being anti-American is normal. Yeah, it's not being reflected. It's not a stance you choose. It's part of your Latin American DNA, at least in political discourse for the last 100 years. Right? So this will not change. But the question is, for what do you use it? Yeah, and this instrumentality of anti-Americanism might change.
Yeah, I mean, after a half century of coups supported by the CIA, from Guatemala starting in '54, the year that I believe Chavez was born, to leading up through Allende, through the funding of the Contras in Central America, through essentially a half century of managerial control over the continent, the neoliberal era of the 90s, which Washington led. Chavez rose up. I was living in Bolivia in that time, and he was the first, but you could feel that trend, that anger, that as globalization was sort of peaking in a way, that led to Morales in Bolivia, and to Correa in Ecuador, and to Ortega in Nicaragua, and of course Bachelet, more moderate in Chile, but this whole wave that he essentially, by standing up and calling America for what it was, he led something unprecedented.
Yeah, exactly. That was and is part of Latin American speech, no? But that is.
I think there's also a Cuban factor here, right? You talked about the coups up until the 1980s, well, the military dictatorships and the coups before. I understand that this reinforced anti-Americanism, but especially the radical left in Latin America needs the United States as an enemy, at least rhetorically, because the Cuban Revolution, which is basically the godfather or the father of this radical left tide, was basically an anti-American revolution. So I think they can't get rid of it. Yeah.
I think Amy Goodman yesterday on Democracy Now! In America said a joke that Latin Americans say about America: there will never be a coup in the U.S. because there's no U.S. embassy there. Which is amusing.
And Ana, Cuba, Bolivia, Ecuador, all countries that have been inspired by Chavez's left-wing revival, if you will. What do you think is going to happen in those countries now that Chavez has passed away?
Yeah, that is a big question now, no? What will happen with this Bolivarian project for the region? I think most of the countries are waiting for that this cooperation will be there. But I am not sure if Venezuela will be support anymore this project. And now if we see the other countries of the ALBA, we cannot find really a leader there. Maybe in Cuba, but Cuba doesn't have the oil that Venezuela has. Therefore, I don't have at the moment the answer. But one thing interesting too with Cuba is we can see that Cuba still is an important country for the region. This small island is an important thing. There were traveling all the other presidents of the region for visiting Chavez. The Castro's brother have the key of, okay, you can visit Chavez or not. That is something.
This is Cuban exceptionalism, yeah. And it's been going on since the 1950s, since the revolution. And it's so interesting to see that Cuba punching so far above its weight still. And now, by default, Fidel Castro is again the poster child of the revolution because Chavez is dead. This is so interesting. But we see some jockeying in the other countries, especially the ALBA group. Daniel Ortega is really trying to pick up the mantle, but his country is just too small and too unimportant. Evo Morales has the charisma charisma, but it's probably too indigenous, so that will not carry throughout Latin America. So there's probably
charisma for Bolivia, maybe,
exactly,
but not for the region.
Right.
But the momentum has started to shift with the World Bank. I mean, that was why he did this, right? To say we don't need Western, European and American investment with incredible interest rates that are going to cripple us over decades of paying them off for infrastructure projects. We're going to fund them ourselves with our petrodollars. I think that general trend is going to continue if Maduro keeps that Chavista line in order.
I agree. The petrodiplomacy is going to go on because it's the single most efficient instrument they have in foreign policy. So even by default, it has to go on if it wants to keep some influence. But even Venezuela, with all its oil wealth, does not have enough power, not even enough oil, to actually create a real South American integration project. It has not worked, not even in 2006 when it was at its peak. And now it's going to be even less centered on South America. Why? Because Brazil is there. And the new development money comes actually from BNDES, from the Brazilian Development Bank. This is the new player in South American infrastructure development, not Venezuelan oil money. But Venezuela will keep its influence in the Caribbean and in Central America. Why? Because Venezuela is a leader for those countries, because those countries are dependent on resource imports.
And what do you make of Venezuela's relationship with Tehran, with Iran? What do you think is going to happen with that now that Chavez has passed away?
Yeah, I called it the second axis of evil, or the axis of good, actually, as they called themselves. The Iran connection is detrimental to Venezuela's foreign image. At the same time, it was full of promise and hope, but not many projects, if any at all, actually came to fruition. So domestically, Venezuela does not need the Iran connection. So I think it's going to go down. Part of this pragmatic shift in Venezuelan foreign policy.
Yeah, and Iran mainly investment in media and industry in Venezuela, and they have a long-term relationship before Chavez in the OPEC. But I don't see so that they will keep in the relationship with Maduro because. I say again, I think they need to have more pragmatic relationship. Yeah.
Was that relationship with Tehran first and foremost just a sign, if you will, of solidarity against the United States?
Certainly a part of it, as was relationship with Putin and upping Venezuela's military capacity. I mean, they've bought how many jets and even submarines. I mean, their major military relationship with Russia as a kind of an affront to say this is our new trading partner. And Chavez's constant over-vigilance, it was part of his whole persona, right? And in America considered him a clown in that sense, but his idea that we're ready for an invasion at any moment, you Yankees come in and we've got our top-level military ready to defend. It was a bit preposterous, but it made the point that he's not joking with the hundreds of millions he was spending.
There's a big problem there. And the problem is politicization, right? Not just of the traditional political and judicial organs, but also of the military, which is now stronger than it was 10 years ago. And also, Chavez armed militias, right? So there's many more even light weapons, small weapons, in Venezuela now. And some observers think there's a higher potential now for a bloody kind of transition, especially if the military does not approve of the next leadership.
But I believe that the transition will be really quiet without violence, especially because the military power is supporting the government. I cannot see a more problematic situation in this way in Venezuela.
There's different groups in the military, though.
Yeah, probably, yeah, but...
They've got their Colombia issue as well, the border issues with FARC. I mean, there are a number of hot spots sort of pressuring them, no?
So the opinion seems to be, if I understand you all correctly, that foreign policy, Venezuelan foreign policy, will be more pragmatic from now on. But let's look at Venezuela, the country, again. What will happen now? How much of a legacy will Hugo Chávez indeed leave behind, aside from all the things that he has accomplished, which we've already discussed in detail? But how much really, the figure, the person, Hugo Chávez?
Mainly it's the support of the people, no? And maybe mainly are these social programs. this social program nobody can remove anymore, because the moment that someone try to remove this social program, the country can go to instability.
It's interesting. The Economist just had a piece out, and Michael Reed said that even though it looks like Venezuela has been completely transformed, many of the things were actually so much tied to the persona of Chavez that after Chavez they can be undone quite fast. I'm not so sure. I think a lot of things are going to stay, and the misiones in the barrios are one thing. And Chavez as a person, of course, is now, he's been elevated into the Latin American pantheon. I mean, he's immortal now. So as a person, he was tremendously influential.
Yeah, no, he always had that since his beginning, right? That idea of a Bolivarian figure who would hold the sword of Bolivar and would say, I am here to help unite this continent that failed to unite 2 centuries ago, but we have a chance now in this historic moment. I mean, he really was riding the tide of the era, both as oil prices rose, obviously, financially, and also politically, as America turned its gaze elsewhere and for the first time sort of permitted by default developments, a leftist rise, which it had stalled for decades through interventions. So, I think he'll be remembered significantly for that, and for wealth inequality, for raising the issues which now a lot of the world is also raising, that inequality is unacceptable at this level of a purely an elite with a mass of starving, hungry, desperate people who need education and health care. This is untenable, and this is now the message that across the world is resonating since the Arab Spring, and in America and Europe, we're echoing that at this point.
Judith Zweig from the Council on Foreign Relations, she said, she argued along similar lines. She said, at least in Latin America, of course, this new discourse against inequality is going to stay now. Yeah, but at the same time, she says the biggest achievement of Bolivarianism is actually ALBA. So, and it's interesting because it's not a domestic program, but rather there's a regional dimension, and ALBA at least is going to stay. So that's going to be the most visible symbol of Bolivarianism for at least the next 10, 15 years.
Since the beginning, it was not an internal project, it was a regional project, no?
And let's talk about the polarization within Venezuela. There are also a lot of people, I don't want to say they're glad that he's passed away, but certainly that he's gone as a political leader, no? Is that a fair assessment?
Within Venezuela?
Within Venezuela.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a group, at least 45%. This is how many people supported the opposition last time, during the last presidential election. So 45% at least. Well, I don't know if they're happy he's gone, right? But they see a chance, a new opening now for maybe opposition movements, but at least for tampering a little bit the heated discourse that Bolivarianism is famous for.
And what are the most important challenges that his successor, whether it's Maduro or someone else, what are the most important challenges that he will have to tackle from now on, from an economic standpoint, but also in general?
In general, the first, is economy, but then criminality in Venezuela. That is something that they have to resolve quickly. I don't know how, but they have to do it.
The idea of internally and the legacy, I mean, I don't know if you'd call him a benevolent dictator, but he wasn't as repressive. I mean, he made sure that his vision, that his persona, his entire worldview was executed, was carried forth as well as he could in Venezuela. But he certainly could have been harsher. I'm sure the opposition and the people who never did like him and who suffered under him, and many people, obviously, like 45%, clearly aren't mourning his passing in the same way that his supporters are, but he didn't leave a legacy that could have been a lot more ferocious than it was in terms of the crackdown. He did crack down on media and on independent voices, but he did it in a way, I think, that will leave him sort of unstained in the way that so many of the so-called autocratic-minded leaders, once they fall, the way they're remembered.
I mean, Venezuela was never a dictatorship. That's just wrong. Chavez won 13 or 14 elections. As he got re-elected democratically. Even if there was fraud, it was not on a vast scale. So he's genuine. He was and still is genuinely liked and loved by part of the population.
It was democratic.
Exactly. It was democratic, but also with authoritarian streaks. Right? It was something in between. This is part of this new political model that the Chavistas propagated. So yeah, and this is going to stay too. It's going to be a legacy, this new very strong executive, yeah? And even if the opposition wins, even if it's just only in 6 years, yeah, all the other branches of government will still be Chavista. Yeah? So my hope would be that the Chavistas can be brought into the political mainstream, at least in the long run, to find a new consensus on development in Venezuela. Yes, and corruption and crime and the economy are the biggest challenges they have to tackle together.
So many challenges for Vice President Maduro, and you said that he rose to power exactly because he wasn't like Chavez. How much do you think that will be of a disadvantage?
Yeah, it's gonna be a problem. Yeah.
But he really has roots that, in a sense, Chavez didn't even. I mean, he was a bus driver and a union organizer and a guy from the.
No, he has genuine legitimacy. Absolutely.
Legitimacy as a people's leader, in a sense, and maybe his humility and his less than Chavez-ness will really serve an example if he can carry forward policies without alienating simply by being.
Yeah, but it's sure that the next president of Venezuela will pay the bill that the vaccine that Chavez government did.
Well, Hugo Chavez has passed away, but he is leaving behind a very rich legacy, as we've talked about. Much to tackle for his successors, though. I want to thank my guests for sharing their insights into this subject matter. I want to thank you out there for tuning in. Looking forward to seeing you again next week for a new edition of Quadriga.